So I want to spend the last few minutes, we have I think 10 or so minutes left, I want to spend the last few minutes on the important geological features of the Canary Islands, those the Canary Islands are famed for. This includes rift zones and giant landslides, lava tunnels, and I will give you a quick summary of the recent historical eruptions in the archipelago. So, rift zones, well, the Canary Islands have what we know as rift zones, or the Spanish call it dorsales, these long ridges, and they're tens of kilometers long, and they are actually the ones that host the volcanic eruptions. So here on Tenerife, we have the northeast rift zone, and Teide sits in the center, the northwest rift zone, and these are the historical eruptions, and they occur along these rift zones, not so much from Teide itself. So these rift zones are seen also on El Hierro, also on La Palma, and this is Hawaii. And Hawaii has rift zones too, but they're not as well defined as in the Canary Islands. And this is actually why UNESCO has given UNESCO World Heritage a status to Teide, because you can see this phenomenon of the rift zones a lot better than, for example, on Hawaii. So here's one of the rift zones, the northeast rift zone, viewed from Teide volcano. It's this area here, and it hosted the 1705 and 1704 eruptions. And here we see the rift zone now from this other end, looking from the Anaga Peninsula towards Teide. Teide is here, and this is a very narrow, long ridge for tens of kilometers. And La Palma has a rift zone as well. This is the Cumbre Vieja, and I mentioned it before. It extends submarine, and it's the area where most of the volcanic eruptions occur. And we have this large landslide scar, the Caldera de Taburiente, and this sits up here. And the new volcano, the volcanic ridge, is growing from it. So the intriguing thing is that people realized early on there's a link between the rift zones and the landslides. And whenever we have rift zones, we likely have landslides. Wherever we have these landslides, we seem to have rift zones. So this is the big crack, the famous crack that opened up in 1949 during the eruption, and which gave rise to the speculation that this area of La Palma might break off into the sea. And this connection between rift zone and landslide is partly used for this argument. The idea is that if you have magma pushing into the rift zone, it will widen the rift and push out the flanks. So there is a sensible reason for thinking that rift zones might actually be the reason for the landslides. So what are these giant landslides? They are enormous collapses, and there's volumes of thousands of cubic kilometers with run-out distances of hundreds of kilometers. And we have them recorded on virtually all the islands. This is a reality. It's not a fiction. So there is evidence for Lanzarote having had some, and Fuerteventura, Gran Canaria, and of course Tenerife, and the young islands where it's most obvious because we have the best record because they are not so deeply eroded. There we see a whole series of large landslides coming from in between rift zones. So this is something we need to be aware of. But this led to a lot of speculation some 15, 20 years ago, and a lot of people got really worried that La Palma will collapse and make a huge tsunami when it does so, and the tsunami might travel all the way to North America and destroy the eastern seaboard. Well, good news, nothing happened in 2021 during the eruption. So La Palma is pretty stable. These events do occur, but they're very rare on human timescales. There's no indication that any of the Canary Islands is unstable right now. But if you were to ask me, can it happen? Then I would have to say, yes, it can. But the probability is incredibly low. So this is a numerical model done by some of the researchers that are in favor of this tsunami idea. And the argument here is that if La Palma would collapse, that's the worst case scenario. If it would collapse, it would create this wave, and this wave would travel out from La Palma, and after 5 minutes it would have spread so far. After 30 minutes it would have spread to the other islands here, and after about 9 hours it would reach Florida. So it's not inconceivable, it's a possibility, but a very remote one, I must stress. So, rift zones and landslides, there is a clear connection between the rift zones and the landslides, and these landslides do occur, but I stress, geologically, it's very rare. Here is the island of El Hierro, and here we have a big landslide scar, the El Golfo landslide scar, and this is very young. And there we have a lot of fertile ground in there. So strangely enough, like on Tenerife with the Orotava Valley, these collapse valleys are actually very good for agriculture. They're wind sheltered, and they produce a lot of wine, grapes, and other things. So here's just another impression of El Golfo. It's actually the largest cliff in Europe with about 1,400 meters. And here's some of the older ones. This is the El Jolan embayment, which was a landslide in the past. And here's the Las Playas embayment, and some of the people may have seen it on a trip to El Hierro, at least on the bus trip I was. We had a quick visit, but it was largely covered in clouds, unfortunately. So here is a fracture in the rear of the landslide. This is in this area here. And there's me trying to climb up the fracture. I didn't get much further than this, by the way. But here we see the fault line of this giant landslide. Teide itself is also sitting, in this landslide scar of the Icot landslide, which is the Las Cañadas caldera. And here's the Teide edifice that has grown in there. But there was likely several landslides here. You see that it's a little bit curved, so it's not entirely clear whether it was just one or whether there were some other processes playing a role as well. Gran Canaria, the bite in the apple, I said I'll come back to that. It's a landslide. It's a giant landslide. Here you see the embayment viewed from this area here, and this means that these islands do become unstable once they grow too fast, and then they can partly break off and have material shed into the sea. And on Fuerteventura, here, the southern peninsula had an embayment as well, and indeed, it's also a landslide. So geologically, this is a real process. Now, a few words about lava caves. Don't want to spend too much time on this, but the Canaries are famous for their caves. People have been hiding in there to make sure the pirates wouldn't catch them in the past, and you can visit many of these caves. Here's a few from the various places. Lanzarote is quite famous for them, La Palma and Tenerife. And here's a few impressions from Hawaii. There you can see how these caves form. There's liquid lava traveling underground, and you have a solid crust above. I don't think this is very safe, if you ask me, but here we go. And once the tubes are drained out, and everything has cooled down, you can actually walk inside. So here's a little sketch of how this might form. The lava flow will form a crust, and once the crust is hardened, the interior is still liquid and will continue flowing and can, in fact, drain out, and then you are left with a lava tube. So sometimes the lava tubes have little sky holes. They have little holes on top where the crust may break in or founder, and then you get what's known as hornitos, rootless vents or little ovens, as they're sometimes called, and this is where magma might spill out from the underlying lava tube as long as magma is in transport. Now, this is my friend Juan Carlos and myself visiting one of the caves in Tenerife, and well, for most of the time it was rather dark and I didn't see it, praise the Lord. But once they put the lights on, we saw that the whole cave was full of these spiders. And it was rather, I don't know, I'm not a big friend of spiders. So, and I learned that outside the caves, these spiders are beautifully colored. Inside, they have lost their pigment because they don't need it. It's usually dark in there. Ooh. So I was glad they switched off the light again after a while. At least I couldn't see the problem. So, but a few words about Cesar Manrique. He was an artist on Lanzarote, and he used caves, and he built modern architecture into these caves. So here, for example, there is one of the big caves with little kind of lakes in there, and special species living in there. But Cesar Manrique, he built a restaurant into one of these caves and a concerts hall into another cave. And here on La Palma during the 2021 eruption, we actually see some of them forming. Here you see liquid lava, here you see liquid lava, and then the liquid lava disappears. There is a lava tunnel underneath that feeds these kind of areas down here. And once this is completely cooled, there will be new lava caves on Tenerife as well. So the last bit, and I'm almost on the hour. Sorry for running a little bit over, but it was supposed to be a full hour's talk. For those of you who need to go, I understand, but I'm going to spend another 5 minutes only on the historical eruptions now. And there is historical eruptions reported from, of course, La Palma, Tenerife, and Lanzarote. And there was a submarine eruption off El Hierro. The other islands had no historical eruptions. And this is the 1971 eruption on La Palma, and this is the 2021 eruption. So here's a list, and this is available in various of the articles. I left some over there. Feel free to take a copy if you're interested. And this is a list of all the historical eruptions, starting with the Columbus eruption described by Columbus himself when he was passing the archipelago. He saw an eruption in the mountains, and it turned out to be correct. All the way down to the latest eruption here in 2021. But I should stress, 50% of these historical eruptions occurred on La Palma, not on the other islands. I was talking about the historical eruptions in Tenerife, and the oldest one was reported by Columbus. The last one was 1909, and this was the one that Columbus saw from the ship while going back to Gomera at the time. And they're relatively small, but one of them hit the harbor of Garachico. So this was a bit of a disaster back then. In 1706, it destroyed the harbor basin, unfortunately. So just a few impressions. This is the 1492 eruption, and this is the lava flows of the 1492. And this is what Columbus saw from a distance. And there has been a radiocarbon date. People have found little charcoal pieces under the lava, a burnt tree effectively, and you can get a radiocarbon date, and it fits with the time of Columbus passing. So we're pretty confident that Columbus wasn't making it up. So here's the 1492 viewed from the center of the island. Here's the vents and the lavas. Just a very quick impression. Then 1705, this is the cone of the 1704, 1705 eruption, the Fasnia event, Fasnia and several other vents. And here another view on the same thing, a rather isolated little area. Here's the observatory up there. So this is in an uninhabited area, and it didn't really cause any damage. The other eruption was down here, 1705. It was almost a continuation of this event, just a few kilometers further. And you can see the little volcano here and the lava coming down here. It happened in the Guima Valley, and the lava made it almost all the way to the sea, but stopped just before the sea. There was a little bit of damage because people lived there, but it was relatively small. 1706 was a bit of a disaster. As I said, here's the town of Garachico, and it had this beautiful port for trading with the Americas. And here's an old oil painting, and the lavas coming down were flowing into the harbor basin. Nobody died, but the harbor was left useless afterwards. This caused people to look for another area, another harbor that was more protected and out of the way of volcanoes. And that led to Santa Cruz becoming the capital instead of Garachico. So the 1798 eruption was in the center of the island. Again, nobody got hurt, and this is the vents of the 1798 eruption. So the 1909 eruption, there was some photographs available, and here's some photographs of it. It also happened in an uninhabited area. This is the Chinchero eruption, 1909, and nobody got injured. And people were flogging up there, a bit like on Iceland last year. People were watching the volcano erupting, and it was rather harmless. So Timanfaya, this was the big eruption on Lanzarote, and it lasted for 6 years, and many of the villages had to be evacuated. 20% of the island's surface were covered with volcanic products. This was also a bit of a disaster. So here all the colored areas on this map are actually covered with either lava or ash, and this was a bit of a problem for the island. Many people were shipped off to the other islands at the time, and nowadays it is, however, a major tourist attraction. The Timanfaya National Park, it's this area here in western Lanzarote, and you're not allowed to walk freely there because the idea is that we want to protect the landscape, and we want to also leave nature to itself, and you can actually see the first forms of colonization, lichen growing on the lava, for instance. So this is how it looks, Timanfaya. This is some of the vents of the 1730-36 eruption. And here's a few more impressions. Here we have a beautiful hornito, one of these areas where a lava tube must be underneath. And Lanzarote is quite well known for this mineral, olivine. It comes up in these volcanic rocks, and the local people use it to make jewelry from it. It's very popular with some people. It's not super valuable, if you ask me, but it's got a beautiful kind of slightly orangey green touch, and people say it's got a very calming effect on you. So those of you who have been in the national park, you've seen these experiments. There is some hot air, some hot steam coming out of some of these holes in the ground, and if you put some straw in there, it ignites. And if you put water in there, you get a little geyser, a little artificial geyser. So, El Hierro, we're almost at the end. El Hierro had an eruption that was offshore here. The rift zone continues submarine as well. And there was this submarine eruption 2011, 2012, about 2 kilometers offshore near the village of La Restinga. And this is how it looked. We had these plumes of dirty water coming up, and we had these floating rocks, and the rocks had enough bubbles in them, and they were hot, and they were floating as long as they were hot. As soon as they cooled down and the water penetrated into the pore spaces, the rocks were sinking back down again. Nobody got injured, but a lot of fish died, unfortunately, and this was a fish reserve, this area, and this was a bit unfortunate. So the last aspect here is La Palma, with many historical eruptions, 1585 up to 2021. This is an image from 1677 showing that there was devastation. There's little houses that got destroyed. So history repeats itself. The current eruption was actually just here and close to the 1949 lavas. So in a way, the people on La Palma knew they had it coming, if you will. And indeed, again, preparations were quite good. Nobody got injured, but property damage was, of course, quite enormous. So here's a few impressions. This is a photo from the 1949 eruption on La Palma, which was happening up here and sent lava all the way down to the coast on either side of the ridge, by the way. So here we have the area of the Cumbre Vieja with many of those eruptions, and I have just added a little collage of images from 2021, 1917, 1677, 1949. This is 71, and this is 49 as well. So many eruptions on La Palma, and here's just a few impressions from the last eruption, 2021. And luckily I got special permission, so I was able to go very close to the lava. It was exciting, I have to admit, albeit maybe a little dangerous at times. So this is the volcano that has grown after 87 days. This is the same area on the first day of the eruption. This is at the end of the eruption. So this cone grew in about 3 months. Enormous growth rate with several meters a day. And of course, the area that got devastated here early in the eruption, here later, this is the same area. Well, a lot of damage to the infrastructure and the plantations there. So 2,800 buildings got destroyed, 1,000 hectares of plantations got covered, 70 kilometers of vital roads. But the good news is nobody got really seriously injured. And that's quite an achievement for a volcanic eruption of this magnitude. So, thank you very much. If you're interested, many of those things are in our geology textbook, and it's written with an excursion guide at the end, and you can get this on Amazon, for instance. And then all I have left to say is thank you very much for sticking with me and for your attention. Very much appreciated from my side.